Hello, Garland Nixon here with Dr. Jack Rasmus. We got a lot to talk about, a whole lot going on the international economic scene. Let's talk. All right, Garland Nixon here with Dr. Jack Rasmus. Pardon me if I'm looking away. There's plenty to talk about. Dr. Jack is out of California. He's written a number of books, I believe, Clarity Press, right, Dr. Jack?
Correct.
And including The Scourge of Neoliberalism and all kinds of stuff. You know, one of the things, oh, and by the way, you can find Dr. Jack at Jack Rasmus. That's his name right there, jackrasmus.com. Just go there and you can check out all his good works. All right, let's get going. Dr. Jack, one of the things that you said when we talked the other day on Moats, you said, you mentioned that, or implied that the people in charge right now, the current people steering the empire, as it were, are ready for, shall we say, a shift. So neoliberalism is kind of what we've been under, and you've very accurately described that. But they're like either trying to move away from that or maybe a variation of neoliberalism, okay? For those listening who don't really know what neoliberalism is, what are the tenets, the pillars of neoliberalism, so that people can, because a lot of people will say neoliberal and all they mean is like Democrat, because the word is liberal there and they just automatically associate the word liberal with Democrat. Neoliberal, and I say, well, you know, it's a neoliberal. Well, the Republicans, they're conservatives, they're not neoliberals. That's using the literal term. What are the pillars? How do we know neoliberalism when we see it?
Yeah, well, neoliberalism is a set of economic policies and political consequences that were created starting in the late 70s, the template, and then the early 80s, and it's been evolving ever since. Four policy mixes. You know, we have industrial policy, which is about deregulation and controlling wages, compressing wages, and making unions ineffective, shifting the cost of benefits. That's industrial policy. Then we have fiscal policy, which is government spending and government taxes, and then the consequences for deficits and debt, how you manage that. That's fiscal policy. And by the way, fiscal policy, the spending breaks down into social program spending and defense war spending, right? And then you've got monetary policy, which is about the level of interest rates, basically. Do you lower rates? Do you raise rates? And then the balance sheet of the Fed. And then you have what's called external policy. And that has to do with the flow of goods, trade policy, free trade and all that. But it also has to do with currencies, with the role of the dollar as the key currency, transaction reserve currency in the globe. So those four mixes of policy are a specific kind of mix of policies that took root in the early 80s that enabled the U.S. to come out of the crisis of the 1970s. Economic and political crises in the 70s. So you got to see that is part of the restructuring of the U.S. and global economy that began in the early 80s and continued because initially the policy on external wasn't worked out. Free trade was just beginning at the end of the 80s, and the role of the dollar and all that, and WTO and all that evolved over time. And so did, to some extent, fiscal and monetary policy, industrial policy evolve over time. So it's a dynamic set. It wasn't just passed in the 80s and then frozen. No, they tweak it and they continue to evolve it to maintain what was basically a class-based policy. in that domestically, the whole idea with industrial policy and fiscal policy was to tame the unions and to keep wages low, keep it compressed, right? That was the idea of industrial policy, and deregulate, industries, and deregulate money flows, and all. Deregulation is part of that. Privatization is part of that. You see, academics tend to think that, it's just about privatization, neoliberal. No, it's much broader than that. It's class-based, tame the unions, tame the working class, tame the social movements of the 70s, which it did quite effectively, but also tame the challengers, the capitalist, the non-capitalist global challengers to American hegemony and the empire and dominance. So it's a class-based, interclass, and intra-class. And it worked on the latter as well, because the big challengers in the 80s was Japan. Japan was stealing export markets in the US and so forth. So Japan had to be checked, and Europe to some extent as well. And that was done in the mid-80s with two agreements. One, the Plaza Agreement in New York, that pretty much put a kibosh on Japan's challenge. Japan's economic financial problems then just began and continued ever since. Europe was checked, and of course they undermined the Soviet Union, and they checked that problem as well. China was not an issue at that particular time. So you got to see it as class-based, and really neoliberalism is a kind of academic obfuscatory term for imperialism. It's really what imperialism is about. But academics never really wanted to say that word, right? So they created this term neoliberalism, which has become associated with the whole idea of what's the policy of the American elite in the 80s and beyond with regard to the world and domestic control. That's what neoliberalism is. And think of it in neoliberalism as the restructuring coming out of the 70s crisis of the U.S. economy. Now, the U.S. has restructured several times to expand and or defend the empire. The first restructuring occurred during World War I. That's when we got the income tax, and that's when we got the Federal Reserve and the central bank, and the dollar became a co-currency with the pound and so forth. Second restructuring occurred coming out of World War II, the Bretton Woods Agreement, where the U.S. became, pretty much the dominant hegemon. Those four areas of policy, industrial, fiscal, monetary, external, were shuffled and came out differently at that different emphasis, different, elements and like income tax and so forth, to maintain the dominance and to advance the empire. Well, we had the crisis of the 70s, and neoliberalism was the third restructuring. Now, neoliberalism, as a set of policies that help expand the empire, kind of hit a wall in 2008 and after. They're not working as efficiently as they used to be. They're creating these massive deficits and debt and so forth, and monetary policy, interest rates are not stimulating the economy as well when they lower rates, and it's not checking inflation when they raise the rates. And in fact, if they raise them too much, they stimulate financial instability. We saw that in 2022. So monetary policy, does not work as well in both directions, stimulating the economy and slowing inflation. The same with fiscal policy. They can't keep spending $9 trillion, as we have since 2001, on wars, while they cut taxes $17 trillion, without generating a $36 trillion national debt, which the problem with that is they have to pay bondholders $1 trillion a year now because of that national debt. That's $1 trillion that comes right off the top in the budget every year. And it makes it difficult to continue expanding the Pentagon and fighting wars and hot and cold on all these fronts and develop all the next generation technology weaponry. That becomes more and more expensive while you're paying bondholders $1 trillion, right? So fiscal policy is not stimulating the economy as much anymore. And you can see that in the 2008 crisis and the 2020 crisis. In both of those, they threw $1 trillion almost in 2008. What did they get out of it? They got a GDP economic growth that was lower than the historical average after $1 trillion stimulus. And then in 2021, what did we do? We cut fiscal spending and tax cuts $6.7 trillion. $6.7 trillion. And what did we get? We got a GDP in 22, 3, and 4 of just was basically the historical average. So you got to throw more and more money spending in order to get just the same that you got when you did throw all that money spending. That's a sign that the economy is slowing down, right? Structurally undermining it, and fiscal stimulus does not work, especially when you got to pay for this expanded empire that they got. That's why you got to see what's going on now, I think, is two things. One, it's the beginning of a further contradiction and crisis in neoliberal policy mix. And at the same time, it's the elite is stumbling its way to figure out how to, once again, the fourth time, restructure the economy, because it cannot afford the cost of empire. It cannot afford throwing 300, 400 billion into this pothole war called Ukraine. And who knows how much more it's throwing at Europe. And that's why Trump is saying, European, we're not going to subsidize you militarily anymore. You're going to have to do it yourself, right? That's a big expense. And 800 bases around the world, many of which aren't needed, that has to be cut. U.S. aid and National Endowment for Democracy, that's being cut. But you should think of that as they're cutting costs of empire that aren't strategic anymore. And they're going to use that money to expand the new weapons technology that the U.S. is behind on. Hypersonic missiles, drones, and who knows what else, right? And they're going to move that money to areas they consider more strategic, most of which is the lake called the Pacific Ocean. And China, that's where the U.S. sees its main interests. That's where its empire really is. I mean, the U.S. owns most of the Pacific Ocean. And the Western Hemisphere, too. They got to consolidate back home and strengthen their strategic control of the Western Hemisphere. And that's what the Panama Canal and Greenland are about. Greenland is about preventing China access, now that the Arctic is melting, shipping access down through the Arctic. And also to develop an Arctic strategy to match Russia's Arctic strategy, which is well developed. You see, U.S. has no essential Arctic strategy. It's got to get Greenland to add to Alaska, and then somehow it's got to browbeat Canada with all the 51st state talk to develop the northern territories in the Arctic to have a true Arctic strategy. Panama Canal is about preventing China from its penetration of the canal in Panama. It was buying up and cutting deals with the Panamanian government and so forth. Well, the U.S. policies that kick them out threaten Panama, which they have done, and they've cut a lot of those Panamanian Chinese deals now. And you got BlackRock buying up the ports on both sides, you see. So it's consolidating back to areas that it considers strategic, which is the Western Hemisphere and the Pacific. It can't keep throwing money at Ukraine and Europe, and I believe at the Middle East too. That's sort of on hold. They got to resolve this issue with Israel and Iran, but Trump doesn't want to tackle that right now while he's dealing with Europe and Ukraine. And I see the attack on the Houthis in Yemen as kind of a surrogate attack on Iran, saying, see what we can do? You better talk with us, right? Israel, of course, and the Zionists want the U.S. to go whole hog and attack Iran for them, right? But Trump doesn't want to do that, but he's got to placate them somehow. So he's attacking the Houthis, right? But that's on hold. Somehow that's got to be developed. And the U.S. and Trump realize that somehow they got to come to a modus operandi here with the BRICS. That's a big threat too, to the empire, to the dollar, to the global economic hegemony. So, Pacific, Western Hemisphere, the BRICS. That's where the big strategy and the U.S. interests lie. They don't lie in Europe anymore. Europe is now a political backwater and increasingly an economic dependency of the U.S., and that will continue. But they got to get out of throwing all the money away into Europe. I mean, that's the Cold War. That's the last war, you see. They don't need that anymore, and it's too damn costly. And the U.S. is trying to cut deals with Russia, not just on Ukraine, but a whole series of things that they're discussing now about economic relations. The U.S., instead of throwing money away trying to undermine Russia, wants to cut a deal with Russia and make money off of Russia,
right,
and so forth. And then, of course, you got the same thing coming in the background. China's President Xi is coming to the U.S. What's coming around here appears to me is something like Yalta, 1944, right? When you got Churchill, the British Empire still existed at that time, the U.S. and Stalin, and they decided on the global order after World War II. Well, now you got Trump talking with Putin, Xi coming, and so forth. You got kind of a new Yalta in piecemeal developing. But the significant thing is the UK, Churchill, and Europe are not invited. They are out of the picture, right? They are a backwater politically and economically. But the Europeans don't know that yet. They think they're still, got their empires and they're deluding themselves. They think that they can remilitarize and so forth. Their economy cannot support $1 trillion military buildup without devastating the social program base, the safety net that the people have in Europe. They got it really nice because they haven't had to do a military development and industry to speak of because the U.S. is providing it. Now they're going to have to do it. And the Financial Times even had a headline, warfare for welfare. Welcome, European workers, to the industrial relations model of the USA, right? Where you're going to have austerity and minimal social benefits in order to finance the military bureaucracy. I don't think they're going to get away with it. I think the European people are going to revolt at some point. But you still got that old leadership there that hasn't been thrown out, the Starmers, Macrons, and Merz, who still think that they're a player in the global world stage, which they aren't economically or politically. And they're going to have to be thrown out before this really changes in Europe. But that's the way I see this global picture and what's happening in the big picture, with Doge cuts here, in the domestic economy. That's all about lowering the costs of the federal government, right? Especially the employment costs, dumping those programs onto the states or privatizing them.
Yes.
That's going to happen too. Cut the cost, 2 million federal workers, cut that cost. And of course, those programs, and use the whole Doge thing to go after your political enemies at the same time. So that's domestically fiscal policy. Globally, external policy is in flux, big change. Meantime, monetary policy, neoliberal monetary policy, is just marking time. We had the Federal Reserve decision, we're not going to raise or lower rates. We're just going to continue marking time. I think at some point, though, if the economy slows, Trump and Powell, the chair of Powell, the Fed, are going to have another fight. That's going to happen because he is going to want the Fed to lower rates. But we got this chronic inflation that just won't go away, and it's going to be very tough. That's an example of the contradictions in monetary policy. They can't lower rates without stimulating inflation even higher on a base they already have, and they can't go after really dropping the inflation rate without stimulating unemployment, which is really at 8%. You see, it's not 4%. 4% unemployment rate that they're talking about today is only for full-time workers. There's 167 million workers in the U.S. economy. Maybe 120 are full-time. But we got 50, almost 60 million who are part-time, and they're not in that number of 4%. But if you included them, and there are government statistics that do include them, unemployment's 8%. So, they're damned if they do, damned if they don't. They can't really balance unemployment and inflation anymore. That's a sign of the contradiction of monetary policy, just as the deficit and debt out of control is a sign of the contradictions in fiscal policy, and just as the BRICS are a sign of external policy contradictions. Industrial policy, that's sort of, tripping along here. Wages are nicely compressed. There's no need to be even more radical. Although they're going to cut the benefits. They're going to continue to cut the pensions. They're going after the public workers. You see, in the first phase of neoliberalism in the 80s, they went after the private sector workers and they devastated them. They devastated the unions. We had 22% union membership in 1980. We got 6% in the private sector now. But the public workers were untouched, you see. We still have 35% unionization. Well, you should see this as the new neoliberal industrial policy. They are going after the public workers, first with the federal and then with the state and local. They're going after them this time around. They're cleaning up the public sector union power, you might say.
There are some things within the foundations or context of neoliberalism, I think, that makes it so almost unfixable. Here's what I mean. So the Europeans, oh boy, we're going to get $800 billion and we're going to buy all kind of weapons, right? But within this whole system that they built under neoliberalism, you don't have an industrial foundation, number one. So you can't do that stuff. Number two, there is an endemic. There's the corruption is endemic. Corruption is everywhere. The money's peeled off. The money's taken off. The money's shuffled out to friends and family members and all the things of that nature. I'm being facetious, but you know what I mean. Not just friends and family members, but the way it's set up. It's like the military-industrial complex. It's set up so you just go ahead and you say you're going to try to build a new tank. And it's set up so that you can you continue to do cost overruns and you make it the most expensive tank you possibly can, and you'll make the most money. In the end, you'll come up with something. Or 5 years later, you say, this tank project just wouldn't work, but we made $8 billion off of it, right? It's set up not to work. So now they have an economy in Europe that even if you just came in and handed them the 800 billion, said, there you go. You don't have to borrow nothing. Here's 800 billion. Go ahead and build your military industrial complex. It would all get robbed and stolen, and they couldn't do it because the foundation of their economic system is corruption and foolishness. Okay.
Yeah. Well, first of all,
go ahead.
It's over $1 trillion according to Wall Street Journal.
Right.
And that's just what the EC, European Commission, says. On top of that, you've got Germany saying, we got to spend $540 billion on infrastructure. Well, a lot of that's military infrastructure, you see. So it's going to be closer probably to $1.5 trillion, $2 trillion. But you can't convert industries and build new industries and factories overnight. Most military analysts say it's going to take about 5 years for Europe to really begin to build its own military industries, military industrial complex, right? Right now, they're just playing around. They do a few tanks here, a few planes here, but that's it, right? So it's going to take them some time. In the meantime, I think the Europeans have a choice. Where are they going to get the military goods? Because the war in Ukraine is right now. It's not 5 years from now, see. Well, I think they're just going to buy it from the U.S., you see. I think that's what they're going to have to do. Where are they going to get the money? Well, they're going to try to raise these bonds, these $1.5 trillion along the way. They'll get some money there. But I think they're eventually going to have to go after the $260 billion in frozen Russian assets. There's no other pot there for them to use in the short term until they raise the bonds. How much, Of course, there's big risk with that because if they do that, then, the BRICS and
Well,
the
then
rest
who'd
of the
buy their
world
bonds?
pull their money out. They pull their
And
money out of Western banks. MBS, the Saudis have said, French, if you do this, we're going to take our money out. So Europe's between a rock and a hard place on how they're going to militarily industrialize. It's not going to be easy, and I think the chances are they're going to fail because their economy is just not strong enough. Ever since 2008-10, it's been limping along with double, triple dip recessions here and there, stagnation at best. Monetary policy does not work over there. Their banking system is outmoded in Europe compared to the US. Fiscal policy, they had this rule that, you can't spend more than, I think it was 3.5% deficit in fiscal spending. Well, they just threw that aside here all of a sudden and said, well, now we can do it. Now that, they want to develop military goods. Before it was to keep a lid on social programs, you see. And now they're just sort of scuttling that, saying, okay, we're going to spend 5%. But all the economic indicators in Europe are not very positive, you see. The stock market is now rising because investors think, well, we're going to make money off of this new industrialization. We're going to skim it, like you said. And investors will make money off of that. But the stock market is not an indication of the real health of the fundamental economy, nowhere, not just in Europe. So I think they got a real difficult historical task here to quickly reindustrialize. I don't see where they're going to be able to do that very, very quickly. And that means they're going to become even more dependent on the U.S. They're going to have to buy U.S. goods instead of the U.S. just sending them to Manstein and the other bases in Europe. Now they're going to have to pay full dollar for the American goods, war goods, which is another way of the U.S. Making Europe even more dependent on it economically. It's dependent on it not just because of energy now, because they drove Russia out of cheap energy out of Europe. They drove Russia out of Europe in every sphere. And the U.S. has simply stepped in, U.S. businesses, and they're making nice fat profits now. Tax policy, Biden and Trump tax policy and tariff policy is making Europe even more dependent on the U.S. And now defense spending, they'll be more dependent on the U.S. The U.S. is turning Europe into an economic satrapy, totally dependent on the U.S. And the U.S. knows it, and the U.S. is treating them like less than a junior partner. And that's going to continue. Europe has become increasing American dependency, and it's a political backwater on the globe now. No one really cares what the Europeans do, and they are intent on fighting a war in Ukraine by themselves against Russia. I mean, what folly, absolute folly. These negotiations going on now between the U.S. and Russia is the beginning of the end of the U.S. involvement in Ukraine in war. There will be a bilateral deal, no doubt, at some point. We are seeing the beginning of a European-Russian war, I think, until the Europeans change their leadership and or realize they can't fight that war. They can't win that war.
They can't even get in it. They can't even start. They can't even get people. They're like, we'll send 20 or 30,000 people to Ukraine. The Russians have like 700,000 troops in Ukraine. You're going to send 20. That's not even lunch. And you don't even have, I'll put it like this. Here's the other thing you need. You got to have leadership that's competent, right? Ursula von der Leyen was the defense minister. When she was the defense minister, 2015, German soldiers used broomsticks instead of guns during the NATO exercises. They were so, this is the Atlantic Council, right? This is an Atlantic Council article, right? And this is under her. They've had, the troops were missing 31% of their machine guns, 41% of their guns, more, 3/4 of their night vision, right? Under her leadership, it was their military was a joke, and now it isn't even a joke. There's no punchline. So in order to, I'll put it like this, if I'm a big boater, if I want to get on a boat right now and I want to go to Florida, I got to have a competent captain. I have to have somebody that knows how to handle the boat in heavy seas. I got to have somebody that knows how to navigate. I got to have a competent captain. If they want to rearm to go up against Russia, they would have to have something they don't have: competent leadership. They've got clowns. And I mean, that's an insult to clowns running. So even financially, that's why I think I was saying in the beginning, even if you gave them the 800 billion and they didn't have to raise it themselves, they'd steal it, lose it, and bungle it. Let's talk about the U.S. though. You said the U.S. what they want to do is consolidate the empire, streamline the empire, right? We're going to fire for employees, and we'll use AI, and we'll privatize and things like this. But we're under neoliberalism too. Here's my suspicion: we'll have one of the same problems when let's say we fire 25% of the of federal employees, and we say, okay, we're going to use AI and we're going to privatize it. Once we privatize it and we give the contracts out, and we use AI and we give the contracts out for that, it'll cost 3 times what it costs right now to pay the employees. That the way neoliberalism works, privatization, they're like, we're going to fire these employees so we'll have more money that we can use for Greenland and this and that. When they do it under a neoliberal concept, it's going to cost 3 times what it costs now. That's my opinion. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I probably disagree with that, because you're gonna get rid of a significant part of the federal workforce. You got to understand, they'll take that off the federal budget, but they're going to dump the cost and the functions on the states. So states will have to increase their deficits and their budgets, right?
And they'll have to lay off state employees.
They're going to have to do the final layoffs, right? And they're going to have to raise the taxes at the local level. So it's really just moving the problem onto the state.
It still gets dumped on the workers then. When they raise the taxes, so the workers will pay for this once again.
Yes, the state and local government workers will be the ones who pay. You see, in the U.S., you got about 20 million public employees, 2 million in the federal, but 18 million in the states. It's mostly state and local employees. So when Trump dumps these costs, disbands the education department, that's where most of the employees are, their teachers, right? And dumps it on the states are going to have to cut the hell out of education and lay off teachers and lay off all other public workers. So the crisis in the states, they're going to have the deficit bigger crisis. They'll solve it in the federal to some extent. So
our education system will crumble, and we'll have far less well-educated students now.
Even further. But that's part of neoliberalism. Okay, then, if you can't pay for it, privatize it, right? Let people pay more by going to a private subcontract called private education, you see. Privatization is part of the fiscal consequence of all this. And that's what neoliberalism is too. It's a lot more than that, but that's what it is too. But now you got to understand, even Doge says they're going to cut federal costs, $1 trillion. Doge. The deficit is 2 trillion plus, right? Every year. They're going to cut $1 trillion out of that. Okay. They're not going to cut the whole thing, right? And on the defense spending side, they're just going to move the money around. This is not going to be real cuts that. But you got to remember, in 2011, that's exactly what Obama did. In 2009, there was a fiscal stimulus of about $800 billion to try to get out of the crisis 2009. It didn't work too well, but they spent $800 billion. In August of 2011, Obama cuts $1 trillion, mostly education, out of the budget. He also promised to cut $500 billion out of defense, but that can was kicked down the road, and they never did cut that. Right?
Oh, of course.
Well, okay, you got Doge now cutting the same thing that Obama said he would cut. So that's not going to solve the problem in the long run. It just sort of slows down the fiscal crisis a little bit, right? And now Trump thinks he's going to generate a lot of revenue on top of that by the tariffs. He thinks the tariffs are going to fill part of that other $1 trillion. And he thinks the tax cuts are going to stimulate the economy to generate more tax revenue that will help fill the other $1 trillion. This is the theory This is the logic of what's going on with Trump fiscal policy right now. Whether it works or not remains to be seen. But people should keep in mind that Doge isn't doing anything that Obama did. Really, it's the same thing, right? But now it's wrapped up with bigger tax cuts, and it's wrapped up with revenue from tariffs, you see, and other, here and there. There's different pots of money that they hope to pull together to balance out the 2 trillion. But they're not going to, I predict they're going to cut the deficit maybe by half at best case. And we're still going to have this problem of $1 trillion a year interest payments on the debt to rich bondholders, both domestic and foreign.
Well, they always talk about the debt, but they never talk about who owns the debt, who that debt goes to. So that's the other part of it. As we're like, oh, we've got this terrible deficit, but the super rich people are like, yeah, because you owe me the money. Isn't that the way it works?
Well, that's what neoliberalism is. You see, they used to talk before neoliberalism about, oh, we got to really balance the budget and all that stuff. They still mouth that. They don't mean it. They like the deficits. They like the debt. Neoliberal policy likes deficits and debt because it's a huge income transfer through the bond rates to the rich people who buy the bonds, corporations, banks. A third of it goes to foreign corporations and banks, right? And 2/3 go to American corporations. They love that $1 trillion money flow. They don't want to end the deficit, That's why Doge is only cutting half of it, right? They don't want to end this deficit or the debt. They just want to keep it from accelerating the way it's accelerating, which is the threat, you see.
Now, let me ask you about this. Let's talk about, I'll put it like this. I'm a big, I'm a local Washington, we got the Nationals and the Commanders or whatever, right? Whoever your local football team is, right? And every year, whoever, in the offseason, the local football team goes out and gets some new players and improves. And people are like, we're going to be great. And I always say, keep in mind, the other teams are improving too. So here's my point. The U.S., we got to do this and straighten this out and get Panama Canal. And we've got all of these devious and diabolical plans so that we can maintain some level of dominance in the world. Meanwhile, Russia and China seem like they're doing pretty well too. So if you could talk about the other powers, the Russia, the China, the BRICS, because it doesn't matter even if what they're doing works and we're moving ahead by 10%, they're moving to that. If they're moving ahead by 11%, you ain't gaining any ground, if you know what I'm saying. So talk about what we're doing in the context of BRICS, Russia, and China.
Okay, you got to understand that restructuring the empire and trying to resuscitate neoliberalism is going to be much more difficult now than it was in the early 80s, right? In the early 80s, go back to the early 80s, Reagan, the global South was undeveloped. The global South was dependent upon the U.S. The U.S. just had to look cross-eyed at a country, we don't like what you're doing, and they would automatically soft power. They would do what the U.S. wanted. It's been 40 years later. The global South is an industrial power of its own now, all across the board, not just China, but we're talking about Brazil and Indonesia and all over.
India.
Middle East. This is an economic force. And the U.S. can look cross-eyed all it wants. They're going to thumb their nose at the U.S. And the U.S. can throw sanctions at them, and they're just going to find a way around it. It's not the 80s anymore, nor is it the 80s with China. In the 80s, China was just trying to get its act together, after the 70s itself. And China is a powerhouse now, manufacturing and technology as well. We underestimate technologically the power of China here. A good example to digress is artificial intelligence. You look at the patents filed for AI, about 90% are the US and China, even. There's no other players, really, in AI, which is the next generation of the economy and military weaponry, right? China is a powerhouse now. That wasn't in the 80s. Russia was was devastated by the great depression in the 90s after the Soviet Union collapsed. It has recovered, and it is growing at a rate two times, three times faster than the U.S. It is an economic, with all its mineral and resource base that it has. It is an economic force now that it wasn't just 25 years ago. This is what the empire has to deal with. And the sanctions policy has shot the empire U.S. in the feet, with all these sanctions, which is a sign of weakness, you see.
Right,
if you got to resort to sanctions, you are weak in terms of soft power, and even in terms of tariffs and typical vehicles of our instruments of wielding of economic power, right? The more you resort to sanctions, the weaker you are. And of course, that's what Biden did. And, by doing that, he accelerated the growth of the BRICS, because these other countries began looking around and say, gee, if this is where the U.S. is going, sanctions, and stealing our money. Part of the sanctions is they freeze all your assets, you see, in your country. If this is the way it's going, maybe we ought to find some way to be more independent, right? So Biden did more to destroy the U.S. global empire than anything in any other country, I believe, right? But now they are stuck in this sanctions regime, and they can't get out of it. I just heard U.S. Commerce Secretary Bessent say that, we got to toughen the sanctions on Russia now, coming out of the negotiations, because the dollar is getting weaker and the BRICS are getting stronger, so we have to increase sanctions. Well, that sounds like an oxymoron to me. I mean, if sanctions are undermining the dollar and accelerating the BRICS, how are you going to check the dollar decline and the BRICS expansion by increasing sanctions, right? I think this is just a bargaining chip that Trump is trying to create here in negotiations with the Russians here, but we'll see. But the point is, the mentality of sanctions as a weapon, as a tool for foreign economic policy is just ass backwards. But what else do they have? Tariffs. We're seeing more emphasis on tariffs, right? But soft power is not working anywhere.
Well, that's why they got rid of the USAID and the National Endowment for Democracy,
right?
Basically, because they don't work.
Results. It doesn't. Why throw all that billions, tens, and hundreds of billions at Endowment for Democracy, USA, and so forth, if it doesn't produce any results? We need that money, to develop hypersonic missiles and the drones. I mean, that's a waste over there. So all this comes together, and if you keep looking back at the fundamentals of this, which is the empire being challenged, the empire being too costly as structured, domestically and globally, and they got to change that because empires are expensive. They take money to run, and the U.S. cannot run it very efficiently now. It's gotten overextended, and it's throwing money away in places that is wasted as far as their own economic interests are concerned, you see. So, all these threads come together, in my opinion, here, whether it's in Ukraine or Greenland or wherever, you see.
So ultimately, well, let me ask you this about the current set of tax cuts that are looking to go through. And their tax cuts now, they're allegedly, there's a significant number of tax cuts for the working class, which they are actually tax cuts for the working class. They truly are. And if you could talk about the legislation that is in right now, I imagine there's some pretty nasty stuff in it. Also, there's a few goods for the wealthy people. What are your thoughts on Trump's, or whoever it is, the Trump teams, the Trump administration's big economic bill? What do you see in it? What do you think? Do you think, well, let's just say it gets through, what would it do? So what do we need to know about it first? What's in it?
Yeah, well, it's a combination. It's fiscal policy. It's a combination of spending and tax cuts, right? It's a continuation of Trump's tax cuts of 2017, which provided $4.5 trillion in tax cuts, mostly for businesses and investors. You see, at least 80% or more of that, right? But it didn't have much of an effect because, 1 year, 2018, and then, we slip into the crash, the 2020 crash. It takes at least a year for these fiscal policy tax cuts to take an effect here. But before they could take an effect, they got wiped out. Yeah. They got wiped out by 2021, right? So we don't know. Trump believes to some extent the economic ideology that business tax cuts create jobs. I haven't seen any evidence, empirical evidence, that that's true, that business tax cuts create jobs. What we see under late neoliberalism is the tax cuts, like low interest rates, have the effect of stimulating investment not in the real economy, but mostly into the financial asset markets. Or the money gets shifted offshore as U.S. capitalism expanded. That didn't impact the domestic U.S. market. The financial diversion didn't impact it. Or the money gets redistributed by the big corporations to their shareholders, right? And what we got in terms of stock buybacks and dividend payouts since Obama is $16 trillion. The Fortune 500 companies alone have distributed in stock buybacks and dividend payouts $16 trillion to their shareholders. So a lot of that money goes to shareholders, or they just sit on it. They hoard it. None of those examples, hoarding, shareholders, offshore, financial asset markets, really produce GDP growth. That's why GDP growth is so anemic in the US. And that's why business tax cuts, I don't think, are going to have that big a stimulus again on the real economy. But Trump believes that. The capitalists kind of believe their own ideology sometimes, that, that's the way. Even if it doesn't work, they get the money, you see. So
yeah, exactly. Even if they lose, they win.
It didn't work. That's okay, Or they say, well, we didn't do enough. See, we got to make it bigger next time. So, that's what's going on. Now, the tariffs, he thinks, is going to generate some revenue too, and it will. That's what we saw from his tariff war in 17 and 18 and 19, 2018. It did generate some revenue, but it's not going to generate anywhere near the revenue. But they're going to rely on the tariffs as a revenue source to the extent that the tax cuts don't really stimulate the economy, you see. But then they're going to cut costs too with all the layoffs. All of this goes together. This is all part of the new mix of neoliberal fiscal policy to see if they can resurrect it or not. You see, we don't know that this is going to work or not. It may not generate GDP growth, right? It may not reduce the deficit, real GDP. It may not reduce the deficit. We may continue to have large deficits. We may have a recession, although that's not imminent. I don't believe that's propaganda mostly. So we're in the middle.
You just dug yourself. If it doesn't work, you've just dug yourself in a deeper hole, right?
Yeah, well, that's neoliberalism not working, right? It's run its course. It may have run its course, which means they're going to have to restructure the economy again along lines that aren't neoliberal.
And neoliberalism has almost become like a religion amongst these people. You know what I mean? It's almost like if you oppose neoliberalism, you're evil. I had a friend who he has you might have heard of CASS. CASS is for an economy that stays stable, that doesn't need to grow. But at any rate, he had an alternative economic perspective, and he was a professor, and he was trying to get on and to teach at various colleges. And every time they found out that he wasn't, oh yeah, you're great. They looked at his resume, wonderful. We'd have the teacher there. And when they found out he was teaching that basically, your economy has to align with the workers, it has to align with the environment, different things like, wasn't neoliberalism. It was, okay, nope, you can't teach here. They toss it. And so that's the other side of it is, even though you have a system that's not working.
the economic profession is very conservative. The mainstream economic profession, very conservative, very much committed to models and theories that are sometimes called neoclassical. In other words, they're very ideological. They benefit certain class interests, these ideas. Well, some of these ideas like tax cuts create jobs, right? Oh, free trade benefits everybody, all people, right? Inflation is always because of too much money chasing too few goods. I mean, this is nonsense. This is ideology. This is falsification of economic reality. And if you go and try to teach economic reality, you are bucking against the conservative interests that control the department, that control the university. And if they don't like you, they don't give you tenure, or they just force you out, one or the other ways. I mean, it's not a very secure place to make a career, really.
Well, it is if you go along with the system. It's very secure if you go along.
Oh, it's it's a bureaucracy. It's a bureaucracy. Go along and get along, and you can drift for 30 years and get a small pension and be happy, right? As long as you tell the lies, and miseducate the kids, then you're doing your job.
What about there is a portion that it's Social Security, tips, and the other part of that we don't. But look, if you had to ask me which part might not make it through, that's the part. But it's Social Security, it's tips, and it's overtime being untaxed. If that happens, what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, well, the Wall Street Journal came out with a summary of these so-called working middle class tax cuts that are in the Trump tax spending bill, the budget bill, right? As you indicated, tips, no tax on tips, which will free about $70 billion over a decade, 70 or 100 billion over a decade into the hands of workers who get tips. There's no overtime tax on overtime pay. That's about 250 billion. Not taxing Social Security income, right? This is the benefits you get every month when you're retired, Social Security benefits. That's about $550 billion. And by the way, that tax on Social Security income was imposed at the beginning of neoliberalism by Reagan. Reagan said, okay, we're going to tax Social Security. Before that, Social Security income wasn't taxed, right? Don't confuse that with the payroll tax, which raises that income, right? I'm talking about when you get the income, right? You get taxed again. It's kind of a double taxation. You see, you get taxed to put it in Social Security, then you get taxed when you take it out, right? So that's about 550 billion. That affects, 30 million people, perhaps, that's money in their pocket, right? And then you've got Trump just announced in his speech to Congress a new proposal. I don't know if it's in the bill yet, but deductibility of interest on new auto loans for cars made in the U.S.
Right?
That's a big, because most of your auto payments, $600-700, is interest when it's in the first year or two, right? It's all interest virtually. That's money in people's pocket. And then there's maybe raising the property tax deduction from 10 to 20,000. This is over $1 trillion, of stimulus. Now, the working class and middle class will spend that tax cuts. They don't send the money offshore. They don't use it to invest in stocks and bonds, right? They don't hoard it because they definitely need it and they will spend it. In economics, we call that the multiplier effect, right? The poorer you are, the more total of any tax cut you get, you'll spend. If you're fairly rich, making $300,000-400,000, and you get a tax cut, you're going to save half of it at least, right? But if you're $50,000 a year, you're going to spend the whole thing, right? That's the multiplier effect that stimulates GDP growth, right? $1 trillion there. I think that's going to get through the House. I think the Senate, Democrats are going to block with rhino Republicans, and they're going to cut the hell out of those working middle class tax cuts. I think that's what's coming. But that's the only thing I see that's really going to stimulate the economy, because the business tax cuts are just a continuation of what already existed. It's not a further stimulus to the economy. It'll have the same effect that it had, which is not that much of an effect, you see. But this is a reflection of Trump trying to broaden his base. In the election, he broadened it to the working class and even some unions like the Teamsters, right? And he got a lot more minority votes and even some suburban women. This is MAGA almost at the point of becoming a new coalition that may dominate for several elections to come. And the Democrats are fading further, totally chaotic Democrat Party.
29%, I think. I did want to ask you this. Okay, Trump can raise, yes, he can raise tariffs and no doubt raise some money doing that, no doubt. And as you've discussed, it's not going to affect prices as much as people would, nearly as what people would think. But here's my point. There are other countries, such as China, and there are other countries that are going to say, if you hit me with tariffs, politically, they can't just sit there and take it from a political perspective, because it's like he's going to punch them, and the people in their country are going to look at their leaders and say, that guy just punched you. What are you going to do? So from a political perspective, yeah, if we were just tariffing people in an empty, dominant world where nobody could push back, yeah, fine. But we need stuff from China and other big countries who are going to pay us back. What are your thoughts about that? They're going to tariff us back, aren't they?
Yeah, there's going to be a tit for tat going on, no doubt about it. No one knows whether the imports will be reduced by U.S. tariffs more than U.S. exports will be reduced by reciprocal tariffs on other countries on U.S. goods. No one knows. And no one can model that. They don't know what the hell that's going to be, what that result is going to be. But you see, there's a long-term objective here of Trump, and that is reduce world trade and force U.S. companies during neoliberalism that flowed offshore, invested and moved offshore, particularly in Asia, to come back, right? Part of that is to bring these businesses back to the U.S., but that doesn't happen overnight. That takes 3, 4, 5, 10 years.
Well, and can they afford? Here's the other problem. If I've got a company and I moved over here during the height of neoliberalism, I moved to Bangladesh because I could pay these people next to nothing. Basically, I could go back to the days when we had, before unions, when we had sweatshops here. You know what I mean? The unions and stuff arise. I'm like, well, we can't do it here. I'll just find a country where I can. That's basically what they did. Okay. But also because of our policies, that worker here has to pay more for everything. So in order for him to survive in a predatory economy, I can't afford to bring my company back to pay what I have to pay an American who can barely survive and be competitive on the world market. So they can't really come back and still survive and be competitive, can they?
Depends on the industry and the company. Some of them can't and won't as a result, but some of them, if they're monopolistic companies, big companies, tech companies, they can. Right? And the U.S. will give them some subsidy to do it. That's where Trump's talk about $500 billion pot for artificial intelligence comes in. You see, that's where that comes in. He really wants to lure the tech companies back and some manufacturing, because that's strategic. If you're going to orient towards China and maybe fight China in 2030, right, you got to get those companies out of Asia and bring them back, particularly the chip companies, you see. So, he really doesn't care Nike shoes being made in Indonesia. That's not important, right? Whether that comes back or not. But basically what you say is true. It's basically going to pay more. You see, part of neoliberalism in the 80s was to compress wages, which it did, but to provide cheap consumer imports coming in to offset. I mean, and you go to Target, you go to Walmart and so forth. A lot of these goods, you buy shirts or pants and are much cheaper than if they were made in the U.S. Well, that kind of offset the wage compression. The other thing that offset the wage compression under neoliberalism was putting other family members to work.
Right.
And creating more part-time jobs. So people would have a regular job and a part-time job. You'd make up family income, not through wage increases, but by working more hours, you see.
And making it easier to get credit, so people could borrow that.
That's the other
the
one.
big one,
Credit.
wasn't it?
Right. Easy credit, cheap imports, more family members working, more part-time jobs, gig jobs, Uber, all that stuff, right? That was in lieu of wage increases, you see, and that keeps the masses not happy, but, they're not willing to go out there and start burning down the manor yet, right? So that's neoliberalism too. But the question is, how many more part-time jobs can you create, right? How many more
And the debt bubble
family can you put? And if you're $17 trillion in consumer debt, how much more debt can you take on, right? Coming to,
how much
an end.
Yeah, the question becomes, if we got all of this debt, how much actual money is circulating in the system? If you got $17 trillion of debt here, 36 trillion here, who knows how much, and you got $100 trillion debt, and you look at the actual money circulating through the system, and it's like $5 trillion or 6 or 7 trillion actual of money. It's not sustainable. It's not reasonable to think that can somehow even at some point ever pay that off, right?
Right. Well, the debt, ultimately goes to the finance capitalists, right? All these forms of debt go to the finance capitalists, and they love it because they then speculate and invest in financial assets and become billionaires and become richer. You see, all this billionaire wealth is mostly financial asset wealth, which has been the result of neoliberal monetary policy, where the central bank for 4 decades has just flooded the economy with liquidity, with money, right?
Just for the print money, as they say.
Too much money to produce real goods, so it flows into producing derivatives of this and currency of this and forex of this, and that's part of the neoliberal game too. Create capitalist wealth by using money rather than making things.
Dr. Jack Rasmus, everyone. Follow Dr. Jack Rasmus at Dr. Jack Rasmus. That's you on Twitter, right?
Right.
Also, jackrasmus.com. You can go there and find all of the work, what he's doing. Dr. Jack also has a weekly radio show, and he posts that, and there's links for that at jackrasmus.com. So if you really want to find out what's going on in the world, in the world of money and economics and all that stuff, go to jackrasmus.com and check out Dr. Jack. Thank you very much, Dr. Jack.
By the way, I would add that my next book forthcoming from Clarity Press in the fall is The Twilight of American Imperialism.
Yeah. I can see why you'd be working on that one right now, Dr. Jack. Thanks a lot, everybody. Oh, by the way, follow me on Rockfin, follow me on Telegram, follow me on Rumble. You never know what can happen on YouTube, so you always want to be able to find me wherever I am. If you can donate, whether it's Patreon, PayPal, buy me a coffee or whatever, that's highly appreciated. Even if you can't, don't worry about it. Just share this on all your social media platforms. And by the way, go to jackrasmus.com, share that on your social media platforms also. Thanks a lot. We are out.